My name is Lillian Rowe. I'm 36, and no one remembered my birthday the year I was fired. No email, no card, no smile in the hallway. Just silence. I didn't cry. I didn't complain. I just packed my box, walked out, and started building something they couldn't see coming. Exactly 372 days later, I sat across from the same executives. But this time, I wasn't asking for a job. I was signing papers, and the name on the acquisition was mine. It was raining the morning I turned 36. Not the dramatic kind, no thunder or downpour, just a fine, steady drizzle that made the city feel quieter than usual. I walked to the office like I always did, with my hood up, coffee in hand, and the kind of practiced neutrality on my face that came from years of working in a place where too much expression was read as a liability. I wasn't expecting balloons or cake or even a happy birthday from the front desk, but I thought maybe someone would remember. A Slack message, a mention during stand-up, even just eye contact that lingered a little longer, like someone had made a mental note. Nothing. The elevator ride was silent. I said good morning to Karen from HR and got a distracted nod in return. My team lead walked past me in the hallway, talking to someone on Bluetooth, didn't even register that I was there. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. One calendar notification. Q2 budget review. No smiley face, no confetti emoji, just a reminder that I was still, in their eyes, a function. A role. Something they could probably automate next quarter if the cost reports kept trending downward. I kept my face neutral. I always had. My greatest skill wasn't data analysis or operations, it was disappearing while doing both. I was the person who made everything run smoothly without asking for credit. I had trained myself to take pride in being low maintenance, to not need much. But that morning, as I typed out follow-up emails and triple-checked someone else's numbers, I felt the smallest crack open behind my ribs. The hours passed slowly. No one noticed I hadn't spoken in over 2 hours. No one asked how my weekend had been. I went to the break room twice. The first time, someone had left a stale bagel on the counter. The second time, the intern was heating up soup and didn't make eye contact. I wondered what would happen if I just walked out. If I closed my laptop and disappeared into the elevator shaft and never returned. Would anyone say anything? Would anyone even notice? My phone buzzed once, around 2:47. A calendar reminder I had made for myself. Pick up lemon tart from Claudia's. I had scheduled it weeks ago. A small ritual, a way to make the day feel marked, even if no one else did. I stared at it for a long moment, then clicked dismiss. At 3:12, my manager called me into a conference room. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed. There was someone from legal in the room already, which meant it wasn't a check-in. It was a closure. They used words like restructure, realignment, and forward thinking. They said my role had been valuable, past tense. They said this was about strategy, not performance, not personal. They handed me a folder. Inside, a severance agreement, a list of outplacement resources, and a printed copy of my job description with a diagonal line drawn through it in red pen. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I nodded, listened, signed, stood. They offered me a cardboard box for my things. I declined. I had come in with nothing. I would leave the same way. My desk had always been bare anyway. I had learned early on that decorations made you look like you planned to stay, and permanence was dangerous. As I walked toward the elevator, I passed 2 coworkers laughing by the copier. I recognized the cadence of my name in one of their sentences, but they didn't see me. Or if they did, they didn't stop. I kept walking. Outside, the rain had lightened, but the sky was still low and gray. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the wind press against my coat, and tried to remember the last time I had celebrated my birthday. Not just acknowledged it, but actually felt like it mattered. Like I mattered. I didn't go to Claudia's for the lemon tart. I went home, sat in silence, ordered takeout, and opened my laptop not to job search, but to start something else. Something I hadn't dared to name before. I created a new folder. I called it Day 1. I didn't cry the day I got fired. Not at the office. Not on the walk home. Not even when I sat on the edge of my bed in the half-dark, coat still on, purse still zipped, staring at the wall like it might offer an explanation that the HR department hadn't. My apartment was still, the kind of still that only comes when no one's expecting you to be anywhere else. I looked around at the quiet furniture, the stack of unread mail, the dusty bouquet of dried eucalyptus in a vase that had outlived its scent. Everything in the room was neutral, orderly, impersonal, just like me. I stood and walked to the bathroom. The mirror didn't startle me, but something in it did. I looked, faded, not tired or disheveled, just dimmed, like someone had turned down the saturation on my face. The edges of who I thought I was had gone soft, blurry, like an old photograph left in the sun. I reached up and touched my own cheek as if to check whether I was still there. I was. Barely. It was then that I realized how long I'd been slowly erasing myself. Not just at work, though it was most obvious there. Years of taking on extra tasks just to be helpful. Years of not correcting people when they mispronounced my name or left me off email chains. Years of making things easier for everyone else, even if it made me invisible. I had told myself it was strategy. That being low maintenance was the best way to stay employed. That good workers were seamless, silent, selfless. What it really meant was that when the day came to cut someone loose, no one would think twice about cutting me, because I had made it easy. I changed into a sweater, pulled my hair back, and made tea I didn't really want. I turned on the TV and muted it before the sound could fill the room. I scrolled through my phone without seeing anything. No missed calls. One text from my dentist's office reminding me of an appointment next week. No one knew it was my birthday. No one cared that I was gone. I spent the rest of the evening in silence. Not because I was grieving, but because I didn't have the energy to narrate what had happened to anyone else. I wasn't ready to package the experience into a story, one of those tidy little LinkedIn posts that turns job loss into a teachable moment. I didn't want a lesson. I wanted my name to matter somewhere. The next morning, I didn't set an alarm. I woke up to pale light leaking through the blinds. My inbox was already starting to fill with spam from job boards. I deleted them without reading. I wasn't ready to reapply for anything yet. Not because I didn't need the money I did, but because I couldn't bring myself to shrink again. Not so soon. Not like that. Instead, I opened a blank document. No subject line. No formatting. Just space. And into it, I poured everything I remembered about the company I'd just left. Not the people, the processes, the weak spots, the decisions that always bottlenecked, the meetings that went in circles, the patterns no one tracked. I wrote without judgment, just observation, as if I were auditing a system, not grieving a life. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. In the afternoon, I went for a walk. The wind was sharp, and the city moved around me like I was background scenery. People brushed past me, heads down, earbuds in. I wondered how many of them had been let go quietly, how many of them had ever celebrated a birthday that no one remembered, how many of them were, like me, drifting around with entire architectures of knowledge in their heads, unmonetized, unacknowledged, quietly fading out of frame. When I got home, I made dinner. Ate it slowly. Didn't turn the TV back on. Just sat in the soft quiet, listening to the hum of the fridge, the tick of the baseboard heater, the sound of my own breath growing steadier by the hour. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had a feeling. Something had broken open, not violently, not loud, just undone. And maybe, just maybe, I could build something in the space that was left behind. The first thing I unpacked wasn't a box. It was a thought I had pushed aside for years. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe I had just spent too long in rooms that made me feel small because it served them to keep me that way. That idea sat with me like a stone in my chest, not painful, but weighty. Familiar. It made sense in the way a truth does when you finally stop arguing with it. I didn't have much from the office. A coffee mug, a notepad with a few half-legible doodles from long meetings, a pen that didn't work anymore. It all fit in one tote bag that had sat untouched by my front door for 3 days. I unpacked it slowly, as if by delaying the process, I could also delay the full realization of what had happened. But the truth was, I didn't need a desk full of trinkets to remember. The dismissal wasn't in what they took, it was in what they never gave. I placed the mug in the sink, tossed the pen, kept the notepad. Not because I needed it, but because it had notes in the margins. I didn't remember writing phrases like leverage in silence, watch who leads when no one's looking, bottleneck, which opportunity. I didn't know what I meant when I scribbled them down, but now they felt like messages to myself from a version of me who had been paying attention. That evening, I opened my laptop and created a spreadsheet. Just a simple grid at first. Departments, functions, friction points. I started listing everything I remembered from the inside things they didn't teach in orientation, things I learned by watching, absorbing, enduring, where communication broke down, who always had to be looped in late, which clients were most frustrated, which workflows caused delays. It was data, not in numbers, but in patterns. Some people rage quit, some write blog posts. I built a system. I didn't know what I was building yet. I just knew I had to make something. Anything. I had too much knowledge to let it rot. Years of insight, soft skills, invisible labor. I began organizing it like I was prepping to teach it to someone else, as if the act of sorting would eventually reveal a shape. I read business articles late into the night, case studies, founders' interviews, failed startup postmortems. I wasn't looking for inspiration. I was looking for gaps, for proof that the things I had seen go wrong weren't just culture clashes or tight budgets, but systemic flaws in how companies grew fast and hollow, how they scaled dysfunction and called it ambition. I found myself writing more than I expected. Paragraphs turned into documents, ideas into frameworks. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that I wasn't done with that industry. I was just done being dismissed by it. I bought a cheap printer and started pinning things to the wall. Workflow maps, sticky notes with phrases like trust is a system and slow is expensive. I wasn't trying to manifest anything. I just needed the room to reflect the world I was building in my head. My living space became part office, part war room. No vision board, just facts, patterns, and my name in the center of it all, not as an employee, not as a number, as a force. It wasn't revenge I was feeling. Not really. It was reclamation. A quiet restructuring of identity. I had been reduced to a line item, and now I was writing my own balance sheet. I stopped replying to just checking in messages from former coworkers, not out of spite, but because I had nothing to report that they'd understand. I wasn't polishing my resume. I wasn't going to webinars about how to land your next role. I was building something entirely different. I didn't know if it would become a business or a consultancy or just a polished deck I'd keep to myself forever. But I knew this. No one was going to forget my name next time. Not because I'd demand attention, but because I'd own the room. By the end of the week, the folder on my desktop had 6 documents, 3 spreadsheets, and a name. Project Echo. Because when you work in silence long enough, you learn to make echoes answer back. and I intended to be heard. The folder didn't start with a name. It was just "New Folder" on my desktop for almost a full day. I stared at it more than once, my cursor hovering like naming it would mean committing to something too fragile to hold. It wasn't a business yet. It wasn't a pitch. It wasn't even an idea, really. It was just everything I had left that still felt like mine. But eventually, I gave it a name. Someday. I typed the word and hit enter before I could talk myself out of it. It felt like an inside joke between me and the version of myself who used to sit through meetings thinking, if I were in charge, I'd do this differently. That word someday had always hovered in the background of my working life. Someday I'd speak up. Someday I'd be the one leading the call. Someday I'd stop shrinking myself to fit someone else's chain of command. Now, someday had its own folder. I started dropping things in. Notes from my time at the company, little scraps of strategy I wasn't paid to think about, but always did anyway. Charts I made to explain broken workflows, never presented. Emails I'd drafted but never sent. I wrote memos to no one, breakdowns of inefficiencies I saw every day but had no authority to address. I documented them all, not to vent, but to archive. Like an archaeologist preserving evidence of a structure doomed to collapse. Inside that folder, I started sketching a different kind of operation, a skeleton of a business model, built not around growth for its own sake, but clarity, resilience, human pace. I imagined an organization where no one had to beg to be acknowledged, where birthdays weren't forgotten because empathy wasn't an afterthought, it was built into the operating system. I wasn't trying to start a revolution. I just wanted to prove, at least to myself, that it could be done differently. Someday wasn't about revenge. It was about making the invisible visible. Taking everything I used to give away for free, my insight, my steadiness, my endless capacity to anticipate problems, and building a structure that valued those things on purpose. I spent the nights reading operations handbooks, market analyses, exit stories from companies no one remembers anymore. I wasn't looking for blueprints. I was looking for mistakes. I wanted to know what people ignored until it was too late, because those were the places I lived in, the cracks I used to patch with my bare hands. And in the mornings, I walked. Every morning before I opened my laptop, I walked a loop around the park near my building. I let myself feel the sun, the air, the movement. For once, I wasn't walking to get somewhere or prove anything. I was just walking because I could, because no one was timing me, because time had finally become something I owned. On one of those walks, I saw a kid maybe 8 or 9 selling lemonade from a plastic folding table. His sign was crooked. His change jar was a recycled salsa container, and his grin was enormous. Not because business was booming, but because he'd built something. However small, it was his. I went home and printed out a fresh sheet of paper, wrote, "This doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be mine." I taped it to the wall above my desk. The folder grew, slowly but steadily. I created subfolders, product, partnerships, operations, legal. I bookmarked articles about self-funded startups. I watched videos about structuring deals anonymously. I started to see a path forming, however faint, not just to building something, but to owning it quietly, from the shadows, until it was strong enough to walk on its own. Late one night, I opened the old severance agreement. I reread every clause, every NDA, every restriction, not out of fear but strategy. I highlighted the limits, understood where the lines were drawn, and then I wrote a simple question on a note card. How do I build something next to the fire without getting burned? I pinned that beside the quote. That night, for the first time since being let go, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt new. Not reborn, but reassembled, like everything that had ever made me feel too quiet, too behind, too easy to overlook, was exactly what made me dangerous now. Someday wasn't a wish anymore. It was a map, and I was just getting started. The house was always silent by midnight. The kind of silence that felt earned, not accidental, like the whole world had exhaled and given me space to think. It became my favorite time, not because I was a night person, but because the dark hours gave me permission to work without performance. No pings, no inbox refreshes, no algorithmic reminders that I was falling behind. Just me, a desk lamp, and the quiet rhythm of rebuilding myself from the inside out. The first few weeks after I named the folder Someday, I lived by two clocks, the one the world ran on and the one I kept hidden inside me. During the day, I answered polite emails from recruiters I had no intention of working with. I nodded through Zoom calls with well-meaning friends who wanted to connect me to someone they knew in HR. I kept the script tight, told them I was taking time to realign, that I was being intentional, that I was exploring opportunities. All of it technically true, but not really, because what I was really doing was preparing for something no one would believe until it was already done. At night, I became someone else, a strategist, a builder, a quiet storm. I wrote memos that no one asked for, documents no one assigned. I drafted policies for a company that didn't exist yet. I designed onboarding flows, conflict resolution protocols, performance rubrics that rewarded clarity over charisma. I thought about the version of myself who had sat through years of mandatory corporate trainings that never once made me feel safe or seen or strong. And I wrote what she should have been given. I researched ownership structures, studied how companies were sold, dissolved, revived, learned the language of acquisition, not the flashy headlines, but the back-end mechanics, the spreadsheets, the cap tables, the silence between meetings. I mapped it out on sticky notes across my bedroom wall, a private constellation of power I was learning to navigate by feel. I made a list of every former colleague who had been laid off before me. I remembered their strengths, the way Rob had handled vendor chaos without ever raising his voice, the way Dana had quietly mentored interns who didn't have degrees, the way Mateo had fixed our entire internal dashboard with no title or credit. I wrote their names down, not to reach out to them yet, but to remind myself that talent often lives where flash doesn't. One night around 2:30 a.m., I wrote a 3-page document called If I Ran It. It wasn't a business plan. It was a blueprint for culture. It had bullet points like, no one's birthday goes unacknowledged, and every employee gets 10% of their time protected from meetings to think, build, or rest. I knew it wasn't scalable in the traditional sense, but I didn't care. I wasn't building a unicorn. I was building a mirror for people like me. I started backing everything up twice. One copy in the cloud, one on an encrypted external drive. Not because I thought someone would steal it, but because losing it would have meant losing the only proof I had that I existed beyond my old employee ID. I drank too much tea. I forgot to eat. I started setting timers to remind myself that the body matters too, not just the brain, but I didn't feel burned out. I felt lit from within. Every time I closed my laptop, I left one browser tab open, the website of the company that fired me. I watched as they tried to rebrand themselves after the layoffs. I read their press releases, tracked their headcount, took note of changes in leadership. Their site looked better now, sleeker, more modern. But the cracks I had once held together with invisible glue were still there. I saw them immediately. I made a list. I started talking less when people asked me what I was doing. Not because I was being secretive, but because the truth would sound like fiction. People believe in pivots, not in revolutions born from grief. They understand starting over, but not starting better. They expect your next act to be safer, smaller, more humble. They wouldn't understand what it meant to aim for ownership. Not yet. So I let them think I was drifting, while I wrote memos in the dark. The folder grew thicker with every passing night. I gave myself deadlines no one enforced, built-out phases, version numbers. I even gave my internal project a code name, Larkspur, a flower that blooms in summer but grows its roots in winter. Quietly, persistently. I made a rule: no celebration until revenue, no investors until leverage, no revenge, only receipts. And still, I remembered everything. The way my birthday had come and gone. The way my name had disappeared from the company Slack overnight. The way no one had asked if I was okay. I didn't need apologies. I needed ownership. So I wrote my plans like a woman who already had the keys. I used the voice I'd been told to soften. I structured every file like it would someday sit on someone's desk, not as a request, but as a decision. And when I finally clicked shut my laptop each night, I didn't feel tired. I felt undeniable. The email arrived with no fanfare, no exclamation marks, no bold promises, just a line that read, "We'd love to bring you in to consult on a project related to workforce optimization. Let us know if next Thursday works." It was signed by someone I didn't know, an operations lead with a LinkedIn profile full of keywords and connections that circled dangerously close to my past. The company name at the bottom of the email signature hit like a breath caught mid-sentence. It was them. The same company that had let me go on my birthday. The one that hadn't sent a card or a question or even a follow-up. The company I had spent the last several months quietly dissecting from the outside. I stared at the screen for a long time, not in shock, but in a kind of eerie stillness. This was earlier than I expected. I wasn't ready, not fully, but I also wasn't scared. I said yes. The office hadn't changed much. Same lobby, same polished concrete floors, same overwatered plants wilting in designer pots. But everything felt smaller. Or maybe I had grown. Either way, I didn't shrink when I stepped through the glass doors. I didn't look away when the receptionist asked me to sign in. I wrote my name clearly, deliberately, like it belonged there. They brought me to a meeting room on the third floor one I had cleaned out my desk in. I sat down at the long oval table, alone for a few minutes, letting my eyes move across the room like I was scanning the scene of a memory, now disarmed. The whiteboard still had faint marker ghosts of someone's idea from a week ago. I wondered if they knew how easily ink fades when no one really listens. The door opened, and two people walked in. One was the operations lead who'd emailed me. The other was a senior manager I vaguely remembered from my early years there. He didn't recognize me. Or if he did, he hid it well. Maybe that was the point. Maybe I had been that forgettable, that unremarkable in their memory. It didn't sting the way it used to. If anything, it was fuel. They began explaining the issue. Internal inefficiencies, bloated team structures, overlapping responsibilities, stagnating productivity metrics. I listened without nodding, letting their words pile up like bricks in a wall I had already mapped a dozen times. I knew exactly where the cracks were. I had patched them myself once, with unpaid overtime and unacknowledged insight. Now they wanted to pay me to identify what they had refused to hear before. They asked me questions, broad ones, safe ones. What do you typically look for when analyzing workflow design? What's your approach to evaluating cross-functional alignment? I gave them polished answers. Precise, professional, neutral. I didn't reveal how intimately I understood their failures. I didn't mention the old Slack threads, the broken reporting loops, the time I flagged a broken intake process and was told it was outside my scope. I was a ghost in their machine, and they had no idea. When the meeting ended, they thanked me, said they'd be in touch, asked if I had any availability in the coming weeks for a deeper dive. I said I'd check my calendar and smiled like a person who hadn't memorized their org chart in reverse just 6 months ago. In the elevator down, I felt something loosen in my chest, Not satisfaction, not even triumph. Just a shift, a click, like a puzzle piece falling into place. They didn't see me. Not really. And that was exactly the leverage I needed. I walked out into the city daylight and didn't rush. I stopped by a coffee shop I used to avoid because it was always packed with the kind of people I once felt lesser than. I bought an espresso and took the window seat. I opened my laptop and wrote everything I had just seen. Every weakness confirmed. Every phrase they used that mirrored what I had mapped. I didn't need the consulting fee. I needed the data. Back at home, I moved the file from my general research folder into a new one. Integration scenarios. Because now, this wasn't theory anymore. This was proximity. They had opened the door again, but this time, I wasn't walking in as an employee. I was walking through as the future owner, and they wouldn't even see it coming. The first time I said the words out loud, I was alone in my apartment. I want to buy them. I whispered it like a secret I wasn't supposed to know about myself. A dangerous admission to the still air. It sounded absurd, like the plot of a movie that ended with humiliation or a court case. But the longer I sat with it, the more it stopped sounding like revenge and started sounding like strategy. I didn't want to burn them down. I wanted to own the roof they stood under. From that moment on, everything shifted. The folder named Someday became a machine. I reorganized it into substructures: diligence, valuation, culture, risk, personnel, blind spots. I turned everything I'd collected, every insight, every pattern, every forgotten birthday into leverage. And then I reached out. Not to them, of course. That would have been too loud. Too direct. I reached out to a fund I'd quietly done project work for 6 months earlier. A small, nimble private group that specialized in strategic acquisitions and had a reputation for seeing value in underperforming legacy companies. I knew their language. I'd watched how they operated. More importantly, I understood what kinds of problems made them curious. I crafted the pitch carefully. Declining internal cohesion, stagnant innovation pipeline, brand erosion post-layoff, culture fragility, and a leadership team unaware of just how soft the floor beneath them had become. I framed the opportunity not as revenge, but as renewal. A chance to flip a company bloated with corporate memory into something lean, responsive, alive. I said I could lead the transformation, quietly, cleanly, effectively. They asked for proof. I had it ready. Financial trend lines I'd been watching for a year, notes from my consulting session, red flags buried in their updated operating agreements. I spoke calmly, clearly, without sentiment. It was just business now. Numbers, not nerves. They liked what they saw. And then the questions changed. Would I be willing to run the post-acquisition integration? Yes. Would I remain anonymous until after signatures? Absolutely. Did I understand what it would mean to face them across the table after everything? I didn't even blink. We structured the offer through a limited partnership. The fund would provide the capital. I would step in as managing director post-close. I insisted on one clause. I wanted the acquisition handled under a shell entity with no visible tie to me until after the ink was dry. It wasn't about hiding. It was about timing. I didn't want them to see me coming until I had the power to walk through the front door without needing permission. The fund named the shell entity Halden Systems. It sounded generic, forgettable, perfect. They made the first inquiry through a third-party intermediary, and just like that, the wheels began to turn. I watched from a distance as the process unfolded. At first, the company ignored the email. Then, they responded cautiously. A week later, I received a forwarded message from one of the fund's associates. We're open to exploratory conversations. That was all I needed. I wasn't nervous. I had spent so long anticipating this moment that now, With it unfolding in real time, I felt eerily calm. Everything was lining up exactly as I'd mapped it. The company had been softened by a year of uncertainty, morale loss, and stalled growth. Their board was restless. The leadership team didn't have the stamina for another quarter of strategic repositioning. They were ready for an exit, they just didn't know who they were exiting to. In one of the deal prep calls, the fund's partner asked if I wanted to join the initial discovery meeting via Zoom under my name. I declined. I would observe under a pseudonym. I didn't need to speak yet. My voice would carry weight when the pen hit the contract, not before. I sat in on that call, camera off, listening to the CEO, my old boss, talk about openness to new capital alignment and positioning for the future. He used buzzwords like scaffolding, ecosystem, synergy. The same hollow language he used when he laid me off with a folder and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't know that I was on the call. He didn't know that I was already writing the press release in my head. Later that evening, I poured a glass of wine and stood at the window as the city flickered on below. I remembered the walk home on the day they fired me, the ache in my chest, the way I'd stood still in the rain, not knowing what would come next. Now I knew. The offer would go in by the end of the week. It would be clean, competitive, smartly structured, and it would come from me. Only they wouldn't see that. Not yet. They'd think it was just another acquisition. Until I walked in. The email was brief. Just 4 sentences and a subject line that read, "Meeting request post-acquisition transition." It was sent from the fund's legal counsel to the company's executive team. The body of the message was polite, procedural, and final. It requested a full leadership meeting for the official post-close introduction of the incoming transition executive. The tone made it clear that this wasn't optional. The deal was done. The documents signed. Ownership had changed hands. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere. I sat at my desk, rereading the message like it was an artifact from another life. I had imagined this moment so many times in dreams, in long walks, in half-written journal entries that never made it past a page. And now, it was real. The conference room where I had once been dismissed without eye contact was now the setting for my return. But I wasn't coming back for recognition. I wasn't coming back for applause. I was coming back because I owned the table now. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. sharp. I arrived 10 minutes early. The building hadn't changed. Still all glass and brushed metal, with its too cold air conditioning and neutral-toned art that tried too hard to be bold. I rode the elevator alone, watching my own reflection in the metal paneling. My face looked the same, but still different. More still, more sure. I adjusted my cuffs and checked nothing else. I didn't need to rehearse. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, the receptionist didn't recognize me. She smiled professionally, offered me water, and waved me toward the boardroom. I stepped inside and stood alone, letting the room settle around me. The long table. The chairs I used to help arrange before meetings I wasn't invited to. The whiteboard that once held projections I built, but wasn't allowed to present. It was all still here, but it didn't belong to them anymore. One by one, they filed in. The CEO entered first, talking to the CFO. They didn't notice me immediately. Then came the head of HR, the same woman who had once handed me a manila folder and avoided my eyes. Then the COO. And finally the VP of Strategy, a man who once described my work as supportive but non-essential during a performance review I hadn't asked for. They sat down, opened their laptops, made polite small talk. No one asked who I was. Not yet. At exactly 10 o'clock, the fund partner joined the call on the screen at the end of the room. He greeted everyone, confirmed that the acquisition had officially closed, and offered the usual pleasantries about strategic vision, shared goals, and operational clarity. Then he said, "And now I'd like to introduce the transition lead who will be managing the post-acquisition process and serving as interim executive authority through Phase 1. He nodded in my direction. All heads turned. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, slowly, I watched the realization move across their faces like a wave of static. The CFO blinked. The head of HR straightened in her chair. The VP of Strategy opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. But it was the CEO I watched most carefully. His expression didn't change all at once. It fractured. First a flicker in his brow, then his jaw tightened, then a flush of color behind his collar. He looked at me like I was a glitch, like the simulation had malfunctioned. "Good morning," I said calmly, walking to the head of the table. "Let's begin." No one spoke. I didn't sit down immediately. I laid out the agenda on the table first. I had written it myself, 12 bullet points outlining the initial audit, restructuring priorities, and short-term reporting lines. I spoke clearly, evenly, like I had in the mirror 100 times, but softer now, not because I was nervous, because I didn't need volume. I had weight. When I finally took my seat at the head of the table, I paused. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to acknowledge that some of you know me. Some of you don't, but none of you have seen me in this seat before." No one moved. I smiled once, briefly. "You will now." And then I opened my laptop and started the meeting. They listened. Because they had to. Because the titles on the org chart had changed. Because the ownership docs were already filed and the transaction already wired. Because the future of their roles now ran through me. But also, I think because something in the room had shifted. The silence wasn't stunned anymore. It was reverent. They didn't know what to say. And for once, I didn't give them the language. The first thing I did was remove the extra chairs from the head of the table. It was a small thing, symbolic more than strategic, but it mattered. That seat had always been shared by whoever talked the loudest, whoever interrupted with the most confidence, whoever made jokes that left the rest of us smiling politely, even when they weren't funny. I remembered meetings where 2 or 3 people tried to anchor that space at once, each jockeying for status while the rest of us watched from the sidelines, waiting for the scraps of decision-making to trickle down. I wasn't interested in that kind of performance anymore. There would be one chair, mine. The first full week of transition was filled with theater. Executives pretending to adjust quickly, managers smiling too widely, team leads forwarding me articles I'd already read years ago, as if to prove their relevance. I let it all pass without reaction. I wasn't there to soothe anyone's ego. My role wasn't to explain why I was qualified. That work had already been done in the acquisition itself. My name was on the signature page. That was the only introduction I needed. The office looked almost exactly as I had left it the day they fired me. The lighting was still too harsh. The kitchen still stocked with snacks no one liked. The same potted plant near reception somehow both dying and overwatered. I noticed everything. Not because I cared about decor, but because spaces tell the truth about the people who run them. What they value. What they neglect. This place still carried the fingerprints of a leadership team that managed more than they led. I asked for no welcome party, no onboarding lunch. I made it clear to the fund and the remaining board that my leadership style was direct and deliberate. We were not rethinking things. We were making decisions. I wasn't interested in guiding them to a better version of themselves. I was restructuring, and I would be doing it from the top down. Every day that week, I arrived before anyone else. Not for effect, just to see the building wake up. There's something intimate about the stillness of an office before the first emails are sent. The hum of the HVAC system, the soft clicks of the lights coming on row by row. It reminded me that organizations aren't just people, they're machines. And I was now the one with the tools. I began the audit on day 3. I met with departments individually, not with their managers, but with their actual contributors, the ones doing the unglamorous work. I asked quiet questions, listened to long answers, took notes no one could see. The gaps were wide. The same issues I had seen before, redundant processes, duplicated tools, fractured accountability, were still there, and no one had fixed them because no one had really looked. Until now. There were rumors, of course, whispers in the break room. Someone said I was the new fixer. Someone else said I had history here, but couldn't quite remember the details. A few employees remembered my name, but not my role, and maybe that was fitting. I had been so invisible then that my reappearance now felt ghost-like, unsettling, unexplained. They didn't know whether to treat me like a threat or a mirror. I didn't offer clarification. I didn't seek validation either. The old CEO stayed silent. He attended the first 2 transition meetings and then began rescheduling, citing scheduling conflicts that didn't fool anyone. I didn't chase him down. He was still under temporary retention per the terms of the deal, but I had already begun planning the succession pipeline. The company no longer needed his legacy. It needed a future. On Friday afternoon, I hosted my first all-hands. No PowerPoint, no slogans, just a room full of chairs facing one person, me. I didn't stand at a podium. I sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes level. I looked out across the faces, some curious, some skeptical, some simply tired, and I spoke plainly. I told them the truth, that the company had lost its way, that leadership had failed them in ways most of them hadn't been allowed to say out loud, that silence had been rewarded for too long, that change wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And then I told them something no one had ever said to me when I worked there. I see you. The room didn't erupt. There was no applause, just a heavy collective inhale, like a breath that had been held for years, finally exhaled. When it was over, people left quietly. No one came up to shake my hand, but the next morning, when I arrived at 7 a.m., someone had placed a single sticky note on my desk. It said, simply, "One chair. Finally." I sat down in it and got to work. I didn't need to go back to the beginning. I hadn't forgotten any of it. I remembered the sound of my own footsteps down the hallway that last afternoon, how they seemed louder than usual against the office carpet, how no one looked up as I passed. I remembered the fake cheer in my manager's voice as she said, "We're moving in a different direction," like I hadn't helped build the path they were now walking away from. I remembered the weight of the cardboard box they offered me, even though I didn't take it, because there had never been anything worth packing. I remembered how the air smelled in the lobby, stale with whatever scent they pumped through the vents to make the place feel more polished. I remembered the uneven light of the elevator, the warped reflection in its brushed metal walls. I remembered standing on the sidewalk afterward, watching the cabs blur by, and wondering if anyone inside that building had even noticed I was gone. I remembered that it was my birthday, that I went home alone, that I didn't tell anyone, that I didn't even light a candle for myself. I ordered food I barely touched and sat in the quiet. I watched the hours slide past midnight and told myself I'd figure it out tomorrow. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because there was no room left in me for tears. Only questions, only space. And now, standing in the exact same lobby again, I remembered every second of it. But this time, the elevator opened for me. This time, the receptionist nodded and said, "They're waiting for you upstairs." This time, I stepped into the mirrored box and looked at my reflection without flinching. Not once. The boardroom was lit just the way I had asked, no overhead fluorescents, just soft ambient light from the windows. The chairs were set in a clean semicircle, no barriers between me and them, just space, clarity. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. Everything I had to say was already carved into me, line by line, from years of being unheard. I walked slowly, deliberately, took my seat, waited, and when everyone had settled, I began not with numbers, or metrics, or projected performance. I began with memory. I told them what it felt like to be let go without being looked in the eye, what it meant to be removed from an org chart like a rounding error, what happened when systems prioritized loud voices over steady ones. I wasn't angry as I said it. I wasn't theatrical. I spoke like someone stating facts, like someone describing gravity. I told them I remembered every missed opportunity, every moment of silence when someone could have said, "Are you okay?" But didn't. I remembered being in rooms where ideas were stolen, where credit was quietly reassigned, where the people who kept things running were treated like scenery. I remembered the emails I sent and never got answers to, the meetings I prepared for but wasn't invited into, the evaluations that called me reliable but never visionary, the suggestion box that was always locked, the promotions that never came, the birthdays that never mattered. I remembered all of it, and that was why I was the one sitting in this seat now. Because memory is power when you use it right, when you don't let it rot into resentment, when you turn it into blueprints, into systems, into a structure no one else had the patience to build. I told them the new chapter wouldn't be written in buzzwords. There would be no motivational posters, no town hall theater. We would rebuild from the bones, clear, honest, unflinching. We would become the company that listened not just to leadership, but to the people who had always known where the real problems were. After I finished, there was silence. Not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. The kind that happens when people realize they're not just hearing strategy, they're hearing the reason they still believe change is possible. One of the directors shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, but said nothing. I didn't fill the silence. I let it stretch, because silence, I had learned, wasn't absence. Sometimes silence is proof that something has finally landed. Later that night, when the building was dark and empty again, I walked the perimeter one last time, not to check on anyone, just to remember it this way, lit by streetlights, humming with potential, no longer haunted. I paused by the glass doors on my way out. The reflection staring back at me wasn't hungry anymore. She wasn't waiting. She was home. I didn't throw a party. There was no champagne in the break room, no welcome banners or cupcakes, no forced smiles arranged around a sheet cake. I didn't want any of it. What I wanted was clarity, clean lines, forward motion, the kind of momentum that doesn't announce itself with noise, but with structure. On the Monday following the close, I issued my first executive memo. It wasn't padded with pleasantries or wrapped in corporate euphemisms. It was direct, structured into 4 sections: current state, immediate changes, transition roadmap, and expectations. I didn't use bold fonts or inspirational quotes, just language that landed like fact. Because that's what it was. The facts were these. We were broken. We could either shift or shatter. And I was here to guide the shift. I canceled all standing meetings for the month. I told every manager that nothing was sacred. Every process would be questioned. Every report would be read really read. Every decision would require a why, not just a precedent. I created a new cross-functional team, not of executives, but of actual implementers who would meet weekly to audit what was real versus what looked good in slides. I didn't bring in consultants. I didn't hire a brand firm. I didn't waste time redesigning the logo or refreshing the mission statement. Culture didn't need a tagline. It needed scaffolding. I changed where people sat. Not to punish, but to break the rituals of hierarchy that had calcified over years. Directors sat beside analysts. Marketing sat across from engineering. HR moved out of their glass box and into the bullpen. I took the smallest office. No corner view, no nameplate, just a desk, a whiteboard, and a table for 4. My door was open, literally and metaphorically, but I didn't chase anyone. I let them come to me when they were ready. And they did. Slowly, carefully, like animals approaching something they'd been told was a trap. I didn't overtalk. I didn't overshare. I listened. Not performatively, not with mm-hms and nods, but with silence that said, "I'll still be here when you're done figuring out how to say what you mean." I didn't reach out to the CEO I replaced. There was nothing to say. He quietly phased out of his advisor role. I watched as he tried to insert himself in small ways, forwarding articles, commenting on shared documents, scheduling catch-up calls no one confirmed. I didn't block him. I didn't delete him. I just let his relevance expire on its own. That's the thing about power when it isn't held cleanly. It dissolves the moment people stop pretending it's there. The board was surprised by my pace. One member called to ask why I wasn't doing more messaging. I told him messaging wasn't the issue. Results would speak. And if they didn't, no slogan would save us. There were no launch events, no announcements on LinkedIn. I didn't update my job title publicly. I let people find out the way I always had by paying attention. The ones who needed to know already knew. The ones who didn't would know soon enough. My days became a rhythm of audits, conversations, remapping. I redrew the org chart by hand, not digitally, not with a slide deck, but with markers on a wall. I put question marks next to roles that duplicated. I put exclamation marks next to the names of people who had been overlooked for years. I built the new structure like an engineer, not a politician. I cut what needed to be cut. I promoted quietly. Not for loyalty, not for tenure, but for usefulness. Some people were surprised. Some were furious. But no one could say I wasn't clear. I kept a notebook just for me where I logged every moment I could have chosen vindication, and didn't. Every moment I could have humiliated someone publicly, and instead asked for their input. I read it every Friday, to remind myself what this was about. Not revenge, resilience, not noise, precision. I walked the halls late at night sometimes, when everyone else had gone home, and ran my fingers along the backs of the chairs. I would think about how long I'd sat at the far end of these tables, how long I'd been support staff, the reliable one, the safe bet, and how none of them had seen it coming, not because I'd hidden, but because they'd never thought to look. Now they looked, not out of fear, out of attention. They listened when I spoke. They made space when I entered a room. Not because I demanded it, but because I moved like someone who didn't need to. And in that clarity, there was something more powerful than celebration. There was peace, a kind of calm I'd never known in all my years of trying to earn a seat, trying to be palatable, trying to be safe. That part of me was gone now. She didn't die. She just got promoted. No fanfare. Just clarity. It started like any other morning. I woke before my alarm, not out of stress or urgency, but habit my body had calibrated itself to the rhythm of this new life I'd built. The apartment was quiet, washed in the soft light of early spring, and for a moment, I just sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor and breathing. It was my birthday. Again. 1 year later. I remembered what it had felt like exactly 365 days before. The silence, the absence, the cold precision with which I had been erased from a company that now bore my decisions. That day had started with hope, then tipped into humiliation, and finally collapsed into resolve. I had eaten dinner alone, blown out no candles, spoken to no one, not even myself. Today was different, not because there were plans I hadn't told anyone, not because there were expectations I had learned the cost of those, but because I wasn't invisible anymore. I didn't need anyone to say the words to make them real. I knew exactly who I was now, and what I had built. I got dressed like I always did, precisely, comfortably, in the quiet uniform of someone who didn't need to prove herself through fabric. I wore no jewelry, no perfume, just clean lines, deliberate movement, and the kind of stillness that used to take everything in me to fake, but now came easily. The elevator to my office was empty. I unlocked the door myself. I turned on the lights, made the coffee, checked the reports from the team before the morning stand-ups began, just like always. But as I stepped into the main floor, something was different. There was no music, no streamers, no awkward group huddled near a cake, just a vase, on my desk. Simple, white tulips, fresh, dewy, understated, and next to them, a card, handwritten. It wasn't signed, no name, just one line in neat, unpretentious lettering. Thank you for not forgetting yourself. I stood there for a long time. No theatrics, no emotion flooding the room, just a slow, full-body exhale. Like my lungs had been holding that particular breath for a year, and now, finally, it could leave me. I didn't ask who left it. I didn't need to know. Because the message wasn't about the flowers. It wasn't about the date. It wasn't even about the fact that someone else had remembered what had once felt like the most forgettable day of my life. It was about the fact that I no longer needed to be remembered in order to exist. I had built something permanent, a company that listened, a structure that held, a system that didn't forget people just because they weren't loud or shiny or quick to dominate the room. I had rewritten my place in the world, not with vengeance, but with discipline. Not with noise, but with ownership. And I had done it by starting with the one thing no one could take from me, the ability to remember what it felt like to be dismissed, to turn that memory into a map, to walk it, quietly, until I had built an entirely new address. That afternoon, I walked through the office as usual, met with teams, reviewed timelines, took notes. But every now and then, I'd catch someone's eye, just for a moment, and there was something there. A nod, a softness, a quiet respect that didn't need applause to be real. When I left for the day, the sun had dipped low across the skyline. I didn't make dinner plans. I didn't check social media. I didn't even think about the fact that it was my birthday. Not because it didn't matter, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need it to.